Hello and welcome to this GNOME workshop. My name is Dmitry Kremiansky and I'm a lead environment artist with over 8 years of experience in the industry, including half a dozen movies and TV shows and over 40 trailers and cinematics. In this workshop we're gonna explore the entire environment pipeline for VFX and cinematics with focus on modeling and texturing in Maya and Substance Painter. We're gonna start with guiding principles to reference gathering and finish with the look development and render of the scene. If you are looking to improve your modeling and texturing, I hope this workshop is for you. Hello and welcome to this GNOME workshop. My name is Dmitry Kremiansky and I'm a lead environment artist with over 8 years of experience in the industry, including half a dozen movies and TV shows and over 40 trailers and cinematics. In this workshop we're gonna explore the entire environment pipeline for VFX and cinematics with focus on modeling and texturing in Maya and Substance Painter. We're gonna start with guiding principles to reference gathering and finish with the look development and render of the scene. If you are looking to improve your modeling and texturing, I hope this workshop is for you.
Welcome! This chapter is about reference and resources. So whenever we start a project, we should really have a clear creative vision as to what the project is going to be about, a brief detailing the conditions of the world in which our props or environments live in, their state, their age, and how they look like, and ideally as many photos as we can get of the said props. That's not always the case, but as much as we can, we should try and push for it. What you can see here is an image I created brushing a few photos together, which is going to serve as a concept for the workshop. And here I wrote a little brief detailing what we are expecting to see. Because I was the person who made this concept, I have all the information and I know exactly where the photos were taken and what part of each building is where. But that's not always the case, and if I was given this concept from somebody else, I would probably start asking some questions. First and foremost being asking for PSD file without all the fog and the brush strokes, so I can see clearly into the distance. I would ask for brief, or even prompts if nowadays that was made by AI. I would also ask the concept artist what was his reference, and potentially even use his folder of reference to find my own images. Whenever it's a production, sometimes we have high-resolution photos taken on set. Sadly, this is not always communicated to the artists working on the project. So whenever I start a new project, I always ask if there was a high-resolution on-set reference taken. If you have a higher resolution reference, you should not stop there, but have a consistent white balance set between the photos. Straighten them as much as you can, and even merge them into panoramas. Having too many references can be overwhelming. I tend to find just a few key references for the mood and the model, and within those I find key elements that help me to break down the project into smaller parts. Studying and understanding your reference will help you to identify issues with it, prioritizing it so you can manage your time more efficiently, and deciding where you need support from additional team members or where you can just purchase assets. And speaking of purchasing stuff, I highly recommend you take a quick look at copyright and see what different licenses mean, because oftentimes they tend to be very, very confusing. Even shooting your own reference and your own textures in real life can sometimes be not as straightforward as you think, because some things are copyright protected, and websites such as this can help you find which things have no protections or restrictions on them. Keep in mind that just because you purchased some textures online, or even signed up for Megascans or textures.com or using SpeedTree, doesn't mean that you can actually transfer those files to your client oftentimes, which sometimes can be problematic. So I highly recommend to have at the very least a basic understanding of the copyright laws. When it comes to gathering reference, I have a few guiding principles. I try to focus on quality over quantity, and I try to not overcomplicate, especially when the design is already complicated. And I try to find references that show a clear indication of aging and cause and effect, such as, for example, if there was a war and there were bullet marks on this monument. I embrace repetition because it sells scales after times. Embracing repetition might help you to create a sense of scale in your image, and having consistent design elements repeating in more than just one place. I try to not overwhelm myself with too many references, especially because it requires better organization, but I only gather as many images as I need to understand one particular aspect of the image. In the image here, you can see on the right side there is a seam between the stones, and it's done right around the corner, which seems correct. However, on the left side, the seam is going right through the corner of the monument, which looks very awkward, and having a reference as such is gonna cause us to have a really weird looking model. So I would highly recommend avoiding awkward reference as long as you can. Capturing your own reference and textures is not always possible, sadly, but whenever it is, it can have a really big benefit for your project. From my experience, whenever you visit the location to capture some reference and some scans, it's oftentimes better done after you started working already on the model, because then you know exactly which gaps you need to fill in your knowledge. Some things that are good to keep in mind is, beside all the reference you find online, you can also use Google Maps if your location exists in real life. And to identify and understand better small individual segments of the environment, such as flowers or what types of trees are growing there, you can use Google Lens. And being able to identify parts of your environment, you will be able to organize them better, and you will be able to find better reference. Another important resource is YouTube. If you are trying to find the footage of an area that you cannot normally access, or you try to understand how your asset that you're working on is built, sometimes YouTube will be your best source. After identifying the concept those two locations, I went there and I've tried to capture every single detail I could, such as the windows, the doors, the ground, and all the water damage that you can see on the walls. And after that, I've tried to identify the individual building blocks from which the environment is going to be made of. And as you can see here in blue, those are the lower priority assets, and in orange are the higher priority. And the way I set the priority is that the bigger parts, which are the walls and the windows, are going to be done first, and all the blue, which are essentially decorative elements, are going to be added later. If I wasn't working on this project alone, the blue parts would be also the easiest one to outsource to somebody else. Looking at this image, one of the first things that really stands out is how all the windows and everything else is aligned to the bricks. And because of that, it would really make my life easier if I found the right tileable before starting the model. If the tileable that I will find will be too small in its scale, then the repetition will be very visible. And having a visible repetition is not something that you can avoid having many UDIMs. In fact, it's going to be just as bad. So because of that, I will try to find something that has a relatively large scale whilst still having sufficient resolution, and doesn't have too much variation, because all the individual details, such as, for example, this brick here, if it was repeating every 5 bricks, you would see it repeating everywhere like a checkerboard. When I try to find the base tileable, I'm always gonna try to find the scanned material first, but if I need to follow a certain reference, I might need to improvise. Sometimes you will not be able to find a tileable which looks just like what you need, but you will find something close enough. And in this case, having a Photoshop Match Color, it will help you to bring those textures together. If I cannot find a scanned material, I will try to compromise with a single texture from which I will generate a material using the same map. But if that doesn't work and I still need to follow something closely, I will try to generate it fully procedurally. But bear in mind, fully procedural material is never going to look as good as a photo texture or a scanned material. In addition to all the subscription-based resources online, it's always good to know the free ones, and here are just some of the ones that I use. So what I've done, I've checked online for all the available resources for free, and some of the stuff that you can find here is looking really good and is of potential good use to me. So I will be downloading those tileables and tweaking them to make them look a bit closer to my reference. And I will be looking at tileables from goodtextures.com for different types of detail. But as I couldn't quite find something that was really close, I just dug in my archives and all the tileable that I made in Substance Designer, and this should do as the base tileable. Because when we compare it with the reference, it's not 100%, but it's not that far off. Which brings me to my next point, is having your own private resources. If you are freelancing or making a lot of personal projects, it's highly beneficial to have your own organized library of stuff. But the downside is whenever you use it on a commercial project with a client, it might get a bit finicky. So first, one of the problems is whenever you try to transfer stuff nowadays to a secure network, this is something that you definitely should do with a permission. And another thing, depending on your contract or just the agreement or even a misunderstanding with the client, what can happen is the stuff that you might use that is your own on a commercial project, it might be then claimed by the client. So I highly recommend to have some sort of understanding and some sort of agreement before you do that. And on this note, I want to conclude this chapter and thank you for watching, and next chapter you will be able to see more hands-on work. In this chapter we're going to be talking about blocking out the model and adding some textures to it. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to try and figure out the scale. Looking at this image by itself, it's kind of hard to tell, so what I did, I found another image that had people in it, and I tried and I combined them as best as I could using this statue as a reference. And after assuming that the height of the person here is 165, I kinda just duplicated cubes around with her height, and I calculated that, for instance, this thing is gonna be 330 centimeters, therefore each brick on average is gonna be 20 centimeter high, more or less. And looking here, it seems that this bottom floor is gonna be around 660 centimeters, which is very helpful because then we know that all of this bottom part is 660 from the floor. So a few other things that we need to have here is we need to have the 20 centimeter brick for scale, and we also need the 660 centimeter bottom floor. So I'll start with that. This is going to be the brick, and this is going to be the floor. And now looking at this, I will be able to scale up my reference to the correct scale. It's a bit hard to see, so I'll just make it a bit more transparent. And remember that because we have measured from the bottom where the ground intersects with the wall to the cornicing, I need to stay consistent, and because this wall is a bit further back than this one, I should be really looking at the one that is closer to me and not the one that is at the back. So this seems just about right. And here we go. So one good practice would be is to center this image and to change the clipping of the camera. So I'll just make sure that this is at 0, just so whenever we start modeling, we can then use the 0, 0, 0 as a reference point to duplicate things to the other side. So I'll start with this tower, and it seemed to have 8 sides, so I'll just have 8 axis subdivisions, and in order for it to be facing us, it needs to be rotated 22.5 degrees. And so we'll just quickly start by duplicating the cylinder around and blocking out the tower. You can probably notice in the concept that the windows are starting at different heights, so this is not ideal and we might need to adjust it later, but for the time being I'll just sort of go with the flow. And given that the front of the building, or the entrance rather, is looking much more detailed, it will be much easier for me to use this for reference and ignore for the time being the height of the windows on the sides, then try and adjust the concept and fight it. However, be mindful that when working for production, those are the things that you might need to solve early on, because this is what's going to define the camera work and animation. And once those things are affecting the other departments, you might not be able to change it back. As you probably have noticed, I have a shelf at the top which is my custom shelf called modeling, where I kind of have all the primitives and transforms and various modeling options right over here. So I'm going to be using that extensively. And after having blocked out the bottom of the tower, I can see that the top of it isn't quite aligned with the concept. So that's okay. What I tend to do often is just duplicating the concept a bit to the side and then having a separate way of combining them. And having all those center points on the cylinders is later going to help me to bring it back and snap it where it belongs. So right now I'm not really worried about it, just capturing the silhouette. So I'll just quickly do this. And a really nice way to sort of have nice subdivisions and have a rounded edge is just to bevel those edges once I'm kind of happy with the overall proportion. So I'll just bevel this and play with the fraction values and the segments. So that's much nicer, and then the same thing for this edge. The fraction. And bear in mind that because we're looking from the bottom, this might be a bit tricky and the perspective might be working against us a bit. So what I will do, I will just try to sort of scale it down vertically and then scale those guys. And another fantastic tool is just using the edge flow because it kinda just tries and complete the flow. Like for example this edge, I'll just use it on it. You can see it scales it up a bit, which was looking a bit funky because there was an extra edge right over here. So if I do that now, and you can move right and left with your keyboard keys and just use the edge flow on each of them, and then you can see how gradually they're all moving and creating a nicer curve. So this looks nice. And bear in mind that the middle section is a bit bigger than it should be because of the perspective, but the overall shape is correct. So that looks just about right. I'll just make this a hard edge, just in case. Not that we need to. Actually, I can just slightly extrude it inward for now. So that's the tower. So I will be continuing with the rest of it, and I'll just let you guys watch. So because it's important to have your proxy done as quickly as possible, I will be adding windows on top of the model as opposed to where they should be. And after that, we will be using this just for a guide. Also, this is a good time to start saving. You can use binary, you can use ASCII. Binary tends to save faster and be a bit quicker when you load it, but it's also much harder to recover should something happen to your file. And at this point, one other thing that I really need to have in the scene is my tileable. So what I will do, I will add a cube in here. And if you remember the 20 centimeter brick that I created in the beginning, I'll just bring it over here for the time being. I'll take the original cube, the big cube that I created, I'll add a material to it, delete history. And I'll, instead of left clicking on the file, I will click create as projection, change this to triplanar, fit to bounding box, and I will add the tileable. Onto it, hit 6 in the viewport, and now we can see it. Now the important thing for us is to make sure that this tileable, the height of it, of each brick, is actually 20 centimeters. So I'll take this place 3D texture, I'll take the big cube, I'll snap it to the brick, and I'll scale them down until we have 20 centimeter bricks. So if I take this and I duplicate this around, you can see they are quite close. And I'll just make it a bit more accurate. There we go. Now, one last thing that I need to do, I'll keep those cubes of 20 centimeters just in case. The way I model stuff, I just try to have windows and such modeled within the bricks. So for example, I would try to do doors and windows and any other elements following the bricks as opposed to something like that, because it just doesn't look good when you have L shapes and weird brick connections. So one last thing that I'll do, and later you will see the importance of it in Substance Painter, I'll just duplicate this cube on top of itself one more time, and maybe just one more time here, and then fit this triplanar to group bounding box. And the reason I'm doing it is something went wrong. I'll just do it here. Oh, yeah, and I also need to tile in the 2D node. I'll just use this. I will need to tile it twice. Now the reason I'm doing it is because later in Substance Painter, when I will be texturing it, I will use those very cubes as a reference to the scale of the textual projection, and having the texture tiled twice will allow me later to change it more easily, especially if there is a visible repetition. So for example, you see there is one brick that is slightly darker than the others, and that might be a problem in the future. However, now that I know the scale of the texture tiled twice, I can just open it in Photoshop, tile it twice, and on the second one, for example this one and this one, I can remove this brick. So one last thing we need to do with this tileable and the cubes, I'll just make sure that they are starting from the 0, 0, 0 at the bottom. And I will put them in a layer and I'll lock it. So I cannot select it in the viewport, save, and now I will start assigning the same material, which is Lambertian, and I should rename it. Tileable projection. And one cool thing that this is going to allow us, it doesn't work so well on surfaces that point like at the 45 degrees, such as this wall. But you can see, for example, on this wall, what it will allow us to do, we can later tweak the texture so that the bricks don't end on the very corner, because stonework should always go a bit around. So we, for example, can get rid of those seams on those faces of this tower. Okay, so that's this side of the tower. In addition to the walls and the windows being at different heights, you probably noticed that the door is not starting exactly where I would want it to be. And on a good concept, ideally, especially if it's a blueprint, you would have them at consistent heights and starting where they should, but I think in here I will have to make some choices later and move things around after I do first texturing pass. Depending on the time constraint and depending on whether or not I need to deliver this to animation, I would keep detailing this proxy and use primitives to block out the rest of the shapes. But after showing this initial stage, I will be moving into more detailed modeling, especially for the parts that are repeating across the model. Now, you can probably see this part kinda goes behind the building, which probably means that I should move this aside. So sometimes the perspective is gonna not be very helpful, especially when you have something like that and you need to be quite accurate. So for example, decisions have to be made whether or not this sort of door goes all the way down to the level of the, well, the wall is ending here, or it needs to be solved in the other way. But for now, I'll just keep blocking it. So one thing that we didn't really figure out is what's the depth of the courtyard. So I found this image which kind of shows what we have in here, and knowing that the height of the floor is 660, I've duplicated the same line over here, and it goes approximately from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, and from here to here. So I would say it's 3.5 because I doubt that this goes all the way in, and you can see the change in color indicates that there's a corner here. So I would say 3.5 is approximately 2,244 centimeters. So we're going to use this as a guide, and it's important to have correct scales for proper depth and just so your image looks nice. So going back to Maya, I'm just going to create another cube, scale it 2244, and that is going to be my depth. I'm not using shortcuts and hotkeys as extensively as I normally do because they interfere with the recording, unfortunately. So I will be mostly using the shelf and just using vertices and the component menu from the right click, as opposed to just clicking F9, F10, F11, F12. So this is going to be the depth of the yard. Same thing on the other side. And there we have it. Now looking at the concept art, which I should crack up, it seems that we have some walls closing in here. So I'll just add something like this over here and over here, and this is now our proxy. And this naturally needs to be down here. And the whole thing, probably it's gonna be much better if I just snap everything to 0, 0, 0. Including those cubes as well. So I'll just select everything. And make sure that this is at 0. When it comes to decorative elements or elements that are repeated across the scene, I find that it's easier and more time efficient to just make them good from the very start, as opposed to gradually refining them. So I would use just very rough primitives to block them out if I had to, but if I needed something slightly more refined, I would probably put in the time and just refine them to the very end. And what this will allow me is to save the time duplicating them around once they have been done, and then duplicating them around once they have been UV'd, and potentially duplicating them around a couple of times with bevels and different changes. I find it somewhat faster to use a cylinder to start with the rounded shapes and then from there extrude and complete the rest of it. But you can use splines, or you can start with just box modeling and then bevel it and use whatever workflow seems convenient for the moment. The biggest thing to keep in mind using this workflow is that when we have different size of shapes, we might want to have different cylinders with different subdivisions, but whenever they are roughly the same size, we can just keep duplicating the same one. Keep in mind that if you don't need your building to explode and it never breaks or changes in any way, you might want to remove the back faces and just only have a slight extrude that's intersecting with the wall to avoid light leaks, because otherwise you're gonna end up with twice, at the best case scenario, surface area, which then uses way more UDIMs than you would want and much more polygons. Whenever using beveling, we might want to check that we don't have edges that are sitting in the same position, which then creates some weird artifacts. So quite often I click on tree in the viewport to see if there are edges that are sitting in the same position, and I end up seeing more faces than I see in unsubdivided mode. An important thing to understand is the scale of the bevels, because having too big bevels or too small can either look a bit CG and not so well done, or also it can imply that the age of the building is very different from what we expect it to be. So for example, older buildings will have softer edges, as the stonework is a bit more crude and has seen some aging, whereas newer buildings will have sharper corners. So we need to pay attention to those things whenever we texture the building, and we try to match the reference, because having a texture that has quite a lot of relief in it, but having straight and sharp edges will look very weird. Before duplicating or repeating elements across the scene, I highly recommend doing even some rudimentary UV on them, just so we can use it for some texturing that can be used in animation and layout, or maybe even later. The only few tools you really need to remember in Maya for UV editing is Modify Unfold and Tools and Unfold Brush, and also the different options of the unfold algorithm. Whenever a shape is complex, I try to just create a few manual cuts on it and then use the unfold brush, which I then scale up to larger than the UV island. And whenever we deal with shapes that are simple and cubical, I tend to do automatic UVs and then just stitch them together. Given that whenever we extrude something, but we move it in a somewhat diagonal direction, the width of the item that we are extruding changes and becomes inconsistent, I tend to just duplicate those decorative trims and use the knife tool to create cuts that are going to be able to split the mesh at the exact angle that I want them to. In order to do that, I have two meshes, one of them which dictates the angle and the other one which I'm splitting. And sometimes the knife tool will not work unless you select the very faces that you want to cut. Once you have done that, all you have to do is just double click once and double click twice in the space next to the model, and then just drag and snap holding V to the vertices of the mesh that dictates the angle, the newly created knife. As you probably have noticed, I'm doing my horizontal and vertical bevels not always at the same time, because oftentimes the corners of the building are going to be a bit more worn out than the different stones that are shielding each other. And one personal thing that kind of helps me to understand if it's too soft or too sharp is to look at the hand of the character model next to the edge and think, how would the real wall next to my hand look like? To have a more realistic look to my building, I will try and stay consistent with the scale of the bevels across different moldings. To have a better idea of how the building is going to be looking like and to test our UVs better, I often assign a shader to those temporal parts based on a ramp to have some sort of variation between the different UV islands. The way I texture things is usually heavily dependent on the UV seams and the way I cut the geometry into different UV islands. And you will see it in the future chapters, but bear in mind that whenever you have a mesh that belongs to the same continuous stone, you might want to have some sort of even a little connection between the UV islands. Another important thing to keep in mind is just trying to stay optimized from the very beginning and therefore trying to avoid unnecessary polygons that are intersecting and also unnecessary UVs. So as you can see here, I'm just trying to cut all the faces that are going to be intersecting with other walls. And I'm also trying to connect the UV islands as much as I can without causing stretching. The optimize brush is very important to help straighten the UVs, and quite often you might want to lay out the UVs using the hotkey Ctrl and L, just so you are sure that the UVs are indeed straightened and they form a straight line. As I'm sort of working from the ground up, I will be starting to work on the most common elements in the concept, which are the moldings and the windows, and those are also going to be the most complex objects to make. So I just really need to make sure that I'm putting enough effort into them and they are versatile and made in such a way that I can easily tweak them for the future adjustments. When it comes to making the corners of the buildings, moldings, and different stonework, I tend to model it as one piece and have the different bricks done in texture as opposed to modeling each individual brick because I just believe that from a distance, as long as you don't need to make any effects on the building itself, it's just going to look better because in texture you can have much more detail, especially when it comes to all sort of plaster and residue between the bricks. Don't be afraid to move your reference and your model, because once in a while you will be in a situation where you cannot clearly understand the curvature or the shape that you're looking at. And being able to just offset your model a bit and follow the lines a bit better might be a big help. One of the things that helped me the most with organization and working in a clean way is having the object details in the top left side of my Maya viewport. This allows me to see if I have unusual amounts of vertices when I'm expecting even numbers, or this allows me to see if I'm having non-manifold edges because the vertices aren't merged properly because they had some distance between them or whatnot. So I highly recommend this tool. It takes just a bit of your viewport and it's not too invasive, so whoever can activate it, I highly recommend it. Now, if you have a large building or you are modeling the different parts apart from each other, it really helps to just make sure that you don't bevel until the very last moment, or you add all the edges that you want to bevel to a crease set, because then you can select them from there. Or alternatively, you can just make sure that you bring the parts that you already have beveled and you compare the relative sizes of the bevel before you do that. If you have the luxury and you have the time, you might want to take some breaks and scroll through the reference to try and understand it better and see what parts of the model you were struggling with and which of them you have done in the incorrect way. Like for instance, you can see that the bottom of this molding, I have completely missed that it ends with a step, and only in the further session looking at the reference I've realized that. Having a small extrusion at the edge of the molding is going to help me to intersect it with the other meshes without any light leaks or ugly edges or anti-aliasing. And also it's going to help me speed up my workflow because this is just another vertex I can snap my pivot to. Given that this building has quite a few types of moldings and quite a few types of windows, even as it is by default, and not even including the photobashed front part into it from another building, I might want to simplify some of that and not model any new types of moldings and just use the same shape language and repeat the existing elements. Once in a while, merging vertices in the object with low tolerance is going to help us to avoid zero surface area polygons and get rid of unnecessary edges. Those moldings are going to be very helpful to help us separate the walls into separate UDIMs, because then we can have seams and different UV islands that are just hidden behind them. Whenever I model window sills and moldings, I tend to not have a flat top on them, because in reality you will often see that they have some sort of slope on them to help the water flow down. And other times, especially if the molding is close to the roof of the building, I like to add some LED coping and flashing on top of it, just for some extra detail. Whenever I need to deal with complex shapes, such as you can see in those window frames, that intersect with each other and they have round and straight and diagonal shapes, I often try and block out some sort of mock-up to see what I need to do and whether or not I would use booleans or knives or just polymodeling. And I definitely recommend taking a couple of minutes and setting up a shader that's going to help you to understand the shape that you have better and see how it holds up against the reference, or just toggling ambient occlusion on so you can see the object that you're making in a slightly more defined way. Now, given that modeling such a shape is going to be very complex from a perspective view, I'll import another reference and I'll just emphasize again what I said in the previous chapter, that it's really important that if you have the opportunity to just straighten the reference a bit more so it's looking correct and you can use it as an orthographic reference. The windows that I'm modeling, they have this sort of interesting shape at the bottom where they are slightly stretched vertically, which is something that we always might want to check against the other angles in the reference and against the other references as well, just to make sure that this is not just an issue with the image or perspective or some sort of stretching. But looking at the reference, it is indeed correct. So to better understand how I will be approaching this, I will be adding blocks and cubes and cylinders and trying to have the shape done as closely as possible. One thing that is always going to help us with both the modeling and the dashing is trying to add edges wherever there are different cuts on the actual stones. A simpler way to approach this would be to model using floaters, meaning that you would have the window made from different geometries. However, when it comes to practice, it has a few downsides. One of them is you're not going to have continuous UVs, which is then going to affect the way you have to texture it. And using tripanel on a complex shape is not always the best. Another way that is going to be not as good is you're not going to be able to have any bevels and any sort of detail accumulating between the different shapes, because then either you would have to add another mesh or have some sort of displacement, which might not always do the trick. And one last thing is you're going to have a lot of intersecting faces and a lot of spent UVs. So the way I see it, I usually tend to approach those sort of details as one continuous piece. But again, depending on the time and the budget that you have, that might not always be the best approach. When it comes to arched windows or any sort of rounded shape that you have in architecture, you might want to use some bend in one way or another, even if you just intersect and cut the middle part to have it sharp in the middle. Because trying to do it manually is not going to give you the best looking result unless this is a crude made building and you do want that variation. But when you're modeling something Gothic or something that has a lot of rounded shapes, I highly recommend you take the time and use those few minutes to use the bevel, the bend. And remember that moving your bend as well as scaling it can help you to achieve different results and different shapes. There is a little jump in the video on the account of the crash that I've experienced whilst booleaning all those parts together. So just keep in mind, whenever you're booleaning, always save before you do that. What you see me doing here is cleaning up all those stray vertices, because they're going to be an issue whenever I'm going to be beveling those edges. So you might want to delete them or just to merge them together if the edge isn't stitched correctly. And that's going to help you with cleaner results with the bevel later. Sometimes after a boolean you're gonna have edges that are not ending where they should, or edges that are not connected properly. So the easiest way to clean them up for me personally is just deleting them and using bridges and append to polygon. or just extruding the mesh and combining it later. Now, once in a while, whenever you approach a complex piece, you might misunderstand the reference, or you might just slightly struggle to capture it in 3D. So take your time, try different approaches, and remember that if it is important to you and it is seen up close, you might want to put the extra time in it and try different ways to tackle it, as opposed to just moving on or kinda just manually moving vertices around and trying to get something that kinda looks right. It's often helpful to take a few steps back, and this is why I recommend to keep duplicating the model you are working on and moving it around in the 3D space. So if you need to go to the previous iteration whenever you didn't have bevel, or you didn't have the other shaped boolean into it, or whatever, then you have it available in the same scene right next to you. Another thing that is going to save you a lot of time is cannibalizing and using parts of the same model whenever you can. So even if it's just a small thing, I would still duplicate it, delete the parts that are necessary, and move it around and stitch it to itself. After considering different approaches and trying to shape the window better, I decided to just duplicate the bottom part and re-boolean it whilst matching the shape better in the reference closer. And with a small cleanup, we should be able to nearly finish those windows. In situations like this, I find it a bit quicker to delete slightly more than what I need to and then just bridge the matching polygons together, as opposed to trying and weld the vertices and cleaning them up as I go, because the boolean might create some vertices that are not in the positions that I expect them to be, or create uneven amount of edges and some other geometry issues. Whilst working on one half of the model isn't always possible, but whenever we can, we should always strive and just work on one half as opposed to cleaning up both parts. When I have to bridge between complex shapes, sometimes instead of using bridge or append to polygons, I just tend to extrude one of the edges a bit and then just snap all of the vertices one by one to corresponding neighbors. Just as you are seeing me doing right now. After combining complex shapes, I always try and hit 3 in the viewport to see if some of the edges are behaving not in the way that they should. And if I see some of them looking funny, then I just delete the surrounding area and I try to refill it from the very beginning. However, be careful, because if you delete too much, then you might end up with a straight line instead of a curved edge that used to be there before. Despite this not always being the best idea, I tend to straighten those lines just so I can snap stuff to them easier, and whenever I need to shift things around, I can select stuff with a marquee tool in a much easier way. Because it's much easier to select the vertices whenever they are on the same horizontal or vertical line. Now, whenever I'm using extrude in Maya, I tend to use the thickness parameter instead of the local translate Z, because what that gives me is a nice and even distance of whatever I am extruding from the initial point, and local translate Z can often fold onto itself and give us some weird artifacts. Using the left half of the window that I have, I will just create the middle section. So I will just duplicate it and delete the faces that I don't need and clean it up a bit. In the interest of saving time, the next parts are going to be heavily sped up. So looking at the windows, you can see that some of them, they have some sort of middle section that divides them into two vertical parts. So I'm going to be using the same techniques as I've shown before. I'm going to duplicate the windows, I'm going to delete the unnecessary windows and cut the new parts using the knife tool with some assisting meshes. And then what I will be doing, I will be just merging them together and adding a bevel in between the newly combined meshes. Having done the UVs on the window before creating any variations is going to help me to take advantage of the existing ones, and whenever I stretch and move things around, all I have to do is just re-unfold the UVs with the newly created seams and lay them in the UV space using the hotkey Ctrl-L. Given that I want the windows to be connected to the wall in one continuous mesh, so I can use different filters on it in Substance Painter without any visible seams and having to paint them out, what I will do, I will just restitch the automatically created UVs for the wall, and I will make sure that they all have no stretches, and if needed I will just unfold them across one axis only, because otherwise it's going to create weird shapes and the edges are not going to be as straight. After finishing this window and unwrapping the UVs on it, I will create this C-shaped molding that is over it, and using that I will just duplicate all the windows of the same type that I have in the scene, and the ones that have more segments in them, I will just create them from the existing ones by deleting and restitching polygons and UVs. Because I'm not sure if the edges of the C-shaped mold they end in 90 degrees or not, because they seem a bit horizontally stretched in this reference, I will just try and bring a new one, because that's going to help me to understand better the shape. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this small section and just try to align it to the reference as much as I can, and try to figure out a way of how will I cut them and then stitch them back together. Whenever I'm trying to use a knife tool or select polygons on more than one mesh at the same time, I'm just usually selecting both of them and hitting F11, which is the polygon selection in the viewport, and then selecting the polygons on both of them. Otherwise, you might have to cut each mesh separately. Whenever you stitch meshes back together, you might need to check what's your smallest distance between the beveled edges, or any edges at all, so you don't merge too much and create weird topology. So this is why with my settings on the merge vertices are set to the lowest distance possible, just 0.0001 or whatever I can set at that moment. Besides hitting 3 in the viewport and checking how the mesh is looking subdivided, another way to see if if your edges didn't merge properly is just doing a planar UV from the camera and checking if there are any seams that are not on the borders of the mesh. Some of the most useful shortcuts to remember are Ctrl-E for extrude, Ctrl-D for duplicate, Ctrl-Shift-D for duplicate special, especially if you have some sort of transform or negative scale applied to it. It can be very useful. And also the shortcut for rotating with small increments, or whichever increment you set really, is J. So holding J, you can rotate the mesh with 15 degree or 30 degree or 90 degree increments. And it's really useful when it comes to rotating those trims at consistent angles and not having to check the channel box that your angle is indeed 15 degrees or 45 degrees or whatever it needs to be. Now, sometimes we will be lucky and the different moldings or different shapes that we are trying to intersect and stitch together, they're going to be rotated at round angles like 45 or 90 degrees. So we know exactly that the angle between both of them is going to be half of each primitive rotated. So for instance, if you have two corners, two moldings connecting at 90 degrees, then the corner between them is going to be 45. But sometimes, like in this instance, we're going to have two different types of moldings connected together with different widths. And instead of sitting with calculator and trying to figure out which angle is between them, the best way sometimes to understand the angle is just booleaning them together, creating a plane which we then stitch or just snap to the vertices that are on the corners of the connection, and then just using on the original mesh the cut that I was doing with the knife tool. Now remember, if you want your things to look tight and nice, whenever you have something that is made with an interesting angle on it, or just any angle really, you might want to select the vertices and move them along one of the edges as opposed to just trying to eyeball it. Whenever you use booleans in Maya, if you have meshes that are open, meaning that they are not watertight and one of the sides has missing polygons, or you have them ending on the same vertex, you might not always get the best results, or it will very possibly crash your Maya, but you can just try and flick between the different modes of the boolean and see if you get something that allows you to see at the very minimum just the line that was created by those meshes intersecting, and that is all you need, because then you're going to use that line to generate the knife. So in this case, as you can see, I managed to get the bottom part of the intersection to form some sort of angle, and you can see it going from the corner that those meshes intersect, but I still need to create one for the left side. I've created a plane, and grabbing one of the sides, I just snapped it to the corner, and the other sides as well to the other vertex on this newly formed boolean, just so we have some straight line in between those two vertices. And using this plane, I will now take the two original meshes that have some sort of intersection between them but are still separate, and I will use the knife tool and I will cut between them. So now all I have to do is just make sure that there is sufficient intersection between the left side of the intersection, and I will just repeat the steps that I've shown you before. Keep in mind that you always might want to save or even save a new increment between the Boolean actions, because they are very likely to crash your Maya, especially with complex shapes or shapes that are going to create non-manifold geometry, which is definitely going to be happening here. Now, as you can see, this is very time consuming. compared to the space it takes on the screen. However, those small things are going to really help us to sell the environment and make it look realistic, because there's nothing more jarring than having inconsistent widths on all those architectural elements. As we're going to be stitching the meshes after creating the cut, and we're going to be cleaning them up, I want to remind you that you might want to keep in mind that sometimes you might want to bevel it before you solve the n-gons, because quite often the edges, the way you solve the n-gons on the intersecting geometries are gonna pull the bevel towards them, and it's gonna look funny. So sometimes you might want to keep it as an n-gon, bevel the corners and make sure it looks nice, and only then solve it, and you might as well have a nicer solution because the bevel is going to create different edges anyway. Another thing to keep in mind whenever you clean things up is, as you can see, the end of the molding is more square in the reference. However, mine is more rectangular because I'm trying to leave me some space to work with, and only after doing the bevel I can then move the edges and the vertices to where they actually belong. Now, in this process, and depending on how the rest of the scene will look, you will see that whenever you have to cut the UV scenes, you might want to follow the existing edges and stonework on the reference, but you might also just use the seams between bricks from the texture, and there is not really a good way of knowing what do you want unless you have experience doing that, or unless you're gonna bring it as soon as possible into Substance Painter, do a test material setup, see how it looks, and there might be a little bit of a back and forth between that, because you might end up with textures that are not supporting what you want to be doing, or you might end up emphasizing the model and the different seams between bricks after having done the texturing, which might not always be the best idea to do before, because, for example, if you have a crooked wall, it might be easier to texture it first, and then adding edge loops on top of the existing texture, you can then move the vertices around, as opposed to having a crooked wall that is then not so easy to texture using triplanar and can only be done using UV space. So having done that and having stitched this C-shaped molding together, now what I'll do, I'll just select all the edges on the corners and edges that needs to be beveled, and I will start adding them to a crease set. Now, the benefits of creating a crease set is you can keep it non-creased until the very last minute, and then you can have a consistent size of bevel between all of the edges because you're creasing them and beveling them at the same time. And another benefit of it is whenever you do a bevel on a complex shape, you are very likely to miss or to add a couple of edges that you don't want to be beveling, and there will be a lot of back and forth, and you will lose your selections, and sometimes you will need to stitch and change the model. However, even if you delete polygons and you manipulate the model, those creased edges, for some reason, they will stay there. So I often tend to just add those edges early to a crease set selection and manipulate the model as I go forward. And only when I'm happy to do a bevel, if needs be, go back, change the model again, and then do a bevel again. So you will see how it works. So after creating those creased edges on the model, I will go ahead and put it back into position where it belongs and try and match the scale of the window frame. And this in turn is going to help me to make the bevels consistent with the rest of the model, at least in the way of eyeballing them. And after that, what I will do, I will just open the crease set editor, and I will create a new crease set for mesh. Once in a while you might want to remove the old crease sets after having done the bevels because they still remain in the scene, and you will see that there is some old remnants of the other sets in here. Now, the benefit of working this way is that I can keep adding or removing edges as I go, and only when I create those said crease sets, you will notice that I have multiple ones, so I can then merge them into just one set, and then selecting edges in the viewport, I can then right click on it and add the selected members, so I just keep removing them if I don't want them. Now, it's important to keep health checking your model whilst modeling, because when it comes to bevels, if you have edges or vertices that are very close to each other, you might get some very weird results, and you're gonna get broken edges, you're gonna get broken corners, you're gonna get all different types of bad stuff. So another way to kind of just check if your model is okay is just to save your scene and go ahead and just in the full geometry selection, not using any components, just hit bevel and see if every single edge is getting beveled, and the scale and distance of the bevel is relatively reasonable considering the distance between edges that you have. And if that looks legit, you can then just go ahead and bevel the edges that you might want to bevel. But if you get some results where there is seemingly no distance between the beveled edges, you might want to go ahead and just hit merge vertices, maybe increase the tolerance a bit to make sure that all the stray vertices and all the stray edges are just merged into one. The important bevel settings for me are just making sure that I have two edges, which also works really well in subdivision, after maybe adding just a couple of supporting loops around and making sure that you have evenly subdivided geometry besides the corners. And another thing is just making sure that the endgons are subdivided. Depending on what you're doing and depending on the results you're trying to achieve, you might want to change your miltering to different algorithms, but usually the auto default setting works well, with very few exceptions, and you might want to just manually restitch and delete some edges if it comes to it, as opposed to just trying to bevel every edge with a separate algorithm. Now, because the edges on this inner sort of shape, they closer to each other than in the rest of the geometry, I will just bevel them separately. And then I will just delete and get rid of all the edges that are now very close to the edges created by the bevel, because we no longer need them. And also they're gonna create artifacts, and they're just pointless really. So after cleaning this geometry and adding a couple of edge loops to separate the mesh wherever there are cuts on the actual stonework, instead of just duplicating it all over the scene, I think I will just duplicate them across a small section of the environment and try and create some sort of vertical slice, meaning that I will get one portion of the environment into a much better position than the rest of it, which again, depending on your production, might not be something you're able to do, but it's still something I highly recommend. And I will take it into Substance Painter to see if my idea of doing UVs is actually gonna work this time, or do I need to adjust it and then duplicate those geometries with the new UVs across the rest of the scene. And it's also a good way of just kind of seeing whatever works and doesn't work in the model, and wherever you can cut corners and just do it in texture. Now, I will not be adding too many edge loops to evenly subdivide the model, because first of all, I don't think I will be using a lot of displacement, and I will be modeling in a lot of the damage and adding some variation in the model with some strategically placed edge loops as opposed to just having a global displacement and subdivision and everything. And another thing in environments specifically, especially if they are out of focus and depending on your camera, you might not always need displacement, just a good normal with a lot of variation can help. The only times that you really need displacement is if you have stonework on the walls that has a lot of relief to it, like very old castles and buildings which have a lot of displacements, and especially corners of the buildings which you want to break up. But a lot of the time, if you have a motion blur, if you're out of focus, or if you're far enough from the camera, you might not need all of that. Like I mentioned before, I'm just gonna look at the reference, see wherever the stones are connected in real life, and try to cut into different UV islands over there. And the rest of the geometry, I will just cut all the corners, which for me personally always gives the best result. And even if sometimes you use a tilable and they're not necessarily connecting well together, if you look at different references of stonework, you will see that sometimes you get different sides of the stone with different colors because they're affected by the sun, they are affected by the wind, they are affected by all different sorts of stuff. So it might not necessarily be a bad thing. Now, for previously mentioned vertical slice, I will be using this left section of the wall left of the entrance and the left sort of tower, because basically this is going to give me a good idea of how it will work across the entire scene. And the reason why I need both of them is because the wall itself is going to have much more irregular stonework as opposed to the tower. Because the tower, you can see it's made from a lot of highly intricate detail and stonework as opposed to just regular bricks that you have on the rest of the wall. So this is going to give me a good understanding and just way of seeing how my materials should work and how my UVs and the geometries should be set up across the entire scene. Now, one thing that I forgot to do in the model and I added in the later stage, I just forgot to create an edge loop which is used to snap those moldings to the wall. So all I have to do is just to select the moldings and select the wall and just create a knife wherever they intersect. And this in turn is going to allow me to just keep duplicating them across the rest of the scene, especially if those walls are a different location or orientation, and I will always have some sort of mutual vertex that I can use to snap them onto. Now, if you remember, I've created a shader based on a ramp with different colors at the different spots of the ramp. So now whenever I take those trims and moldings that I created, and I just lay out them on the UV space using the command Ctrl L, you will see that now each of them gets a somewhat different color and a nice gradient along it, thanks to that. Now, being done with those windows, I can now duplicate them and use the same geometries for the windows in the attics and the windows on the sides of the building, with the exception of the right side, which has some arched windows. And also for the windows on the towers themselves, although those will be somewhat more complex. One thing to keep in mind is just to constantly save and also save increments in case one of them gets corrupted, so you always have an old file to work with. And whenever your Maya is getting less responsive and starting to freeze, this is a good idea to start to clean up your scene using just the command of delete unused nodes from your Hypershade, or just clean up the scene, or even just restart your computer. Now, because the windows on the rest of the building and the sort of entrance and the towers, they look in a slightly different way because they are similar but not very similar. The best idea is to just keep using the same type of window because this is gonna look like it was done deliberately as opposed to, front of the building that was built in a different time period or whatever, unless this is of course the intention. And another good thing to keep in mind is that you might want to make sure that your windows are positioned vertically on the same spot, more or less, because looking at the buildings, you will see that unless you have a staircase or toilets or whichever irregularity that kind of causes a different pattern of windows on the wall, the floors tend to be even and the windows tend to be on the even position, especially if it's the same type of window. So we have to make some decisions here whether or not we are following the backside of the model, which is also distorted by the perspective, or the front side, which is a bit more orthographic almost. And just slowly cannibalizing and reusing parts of the existing meshes that I already have, I will quickly kit bash and create those new elements. Now, I'm not gonna go into a lot of modeling and detailing at the moment with those smaller elements with decorative sort of shapes, because a lot of those things, especially in production, we will not always have time for, or we're gonna have a kit bash kit, or we're gonna have a just the time that we're gonna have to use for it is only gonna be enough to make them with normal map or whatever. So I'm gonna leave those for now and just focus on the big shapes. Another thing to keep in mind is, as you probably noticed, those terrible triplanar textures that I'm using at the moment, they still haven't really came into play. And this is because I want to block out all of the shapes as soon as possible and then see what is my texturing approach is even gonna be. Because after having done that, I will have a better idea of what do I need to be doing in the model as to match the texture better, and vice versa. So we might need to start tweaking those windows and scaling them up and moving them up and down after having done a first pass of texturing in Substance Painter. So after creating this floor from those windows that I already had, I will just make sure that the distances between the different elements are correct. The way I do this, often I just create a default cube, I'll snap it to one place and just scale it up and see, okay, this is the scale, and I'll move it elsewhere and see, okay, this is bigger, this is smaller, and adjust accordingly. And as you can see, there is another thing at play here because we are using the molding that are following the rest of the wall from the original building that is on the sides. We might have to also adjust the model accordingly and move those entire floors up and down so we have reasonable distances between those elements. And like always, just before duplicating the model around the scene, it's a good idea to make sure that it's not including any endguns, everything is solved correctly, the UVs are done right, and that all the unnecessary polygons and edges have been cleaned up. Because otherwise, if you need to make further adjustments, you will just have to try and chase this small model all the way around your scene. Now, in most cases, it's easier and faster to just work on half of the model. However, sometimes I find it a bit quicker to actually just work on a model as a whole and solve one side and then just duplicate the solution to the other side and stitch it, as opposed to trying to delete half of the model, especially if you don't have a clear edge loop that runs in the middle, and then trying to stitch the UVs after having flipped them. So really depends on what works best for you, but bear in mind that sometimes you will not be 100% as efficient as you should be, and that's okay. Because as long as you just keep moving forward and you make good decisions and you have a healthy workflow, you will still finish your task on time and it will look good. So the solution I'm doing here in the corners with those diagonal lines might not be the best, but I think I will just keep it as is for the time being and see how it behaves whenever I'm texturing the model. And this might be something that I might need to revisit, and this is again just to emphasize how important it is to do a first pass and a vertical slice on a section of the model to see how you want it to behave and how it actually behaves, and only then proceeding with the rest of it. And again, finishing the model before starting the texturing is not always a good idea. Depending on the complexity of the model and the stonework, this is probably the stage that I would try and have the window frames, the wooden ones, and the glass done as well, because it would help me to duplicate them across the model. But given that I still want to see what the scale of the stonework should be, I will not be doing those before I have a substance material preset. In the interest of keeping this chapter short, I will be pausing here, and what you will see me doing next is just working on the couple of other types of molding and detail that I want to be bringing into Substance Painter to create materials for first, and then just making sure that I have the windows and the rest of the model on one side of the tower ready for texturing, and I will be bringing those to Substance Painter and making sure that I have a correct workflow and approach for how to texture it, and from there I will be just finishing the rest of the model and adding textures to it. I hope you all learned something new in this chapter, and I'm looking forward to see you all in the next one. Hello and welcome to modeling part 3. In this part of the workshop we're gonna focus on the missing parts of the environment, such as metal, glass and wood. As you can see, I've done quite a big chunk of the environment already, and all I did was taking the parts that we already had and I duplicated them around and I cut them into new sections, such as those windows of the attics, and I've added a couple of decorative elements and I completed the existing ones, such as those parts that we didn't have before. And I now only have the windows, the doors, all the roofs, and this section of the wall yet to be completed, as well as the ground. So, looking at this, I will start by the wooden frames first, because they are gonna be influencing the glass parts, and also they're gonna cover a lot of ground and I can reuse the workflows from them onto those windows. So let's take a look at the difference between how the wood and the stone should look. So whenever we work on something that's made of stone, even if it's exactly the same shape, like this molding for example, whenever it's made of stone, it would be made from rectangular shapes, such as this. And you can see the vertical parts, they would probably not go into the corner, but they would stop with clear horizontal lines that could be easily supported by other stonework. Whereas when we work on something that is made out of wood, as you can see, it's more convenient and also more realistic to cut the UVs and also the model into the corners, such as those. So it creates a more traditional look of a frame that we know from our picture frames and everything else, that is basically supported by those diagonal shapes, and those pieces, they are nailed together. So now that we understand that, let's take a look at the reference of the door. So here is our image reference, and we can see that this door is made from essentially 3 sections, and we have all those ornaments inside it as well. And we can see how, for example, looking at this image, a lot of those ornaments on the stonework, they mostly don't end in a corner such as this one. They kind of end in a way that it's a cornerstone. This whole L shape is a one piece, and only once in a while they just end in the center, which is not very typical. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be modeling the door, and then we're going to be reusing some of this to model the windows, which I'm going to slightly deviate from the reference to make them a bit more interesting, and then we're going to proceed onto those wooden frames, which should be very straightforward to do. And then all we have to do is just to create the glass and other windows, and then we need to do the roofs and the glass in there. So when we look at the doorway, all we need to do here is just to extract those faces, or duplicate them rather. And now if we just select everything except for the edges at the very top, we can bridge it, and we can flip the normals, and we can close those holes and add maybe not, let's not add the central loop just yet. Let's just see how it looks and give it a new material. And now you see we have a door that is matching the frame very precisely, because it's made from the same faces. And this is the same approach I recommend we do on all the other frames as well, simply because if we try and model the door manually and we try to match those curves or something else, they're just not going to match as well as extracting it from the same polygons. And this is something I brought up earlier. It's always easier to extract and work from the outer shell inward than the other way around, because, for example, let's just say I had this door, and now I needed to create a door frame from those faces. So let's see what happens if I extrude those. So I'm going to use thickness, because local translate Z doesn't always work on the corners, you see in here. So instead I'm just going to use thickness so it's nice and uniform. But look what happens here. You see, this is where it starts to fall apart, the middle section, because the further I extrude it, the less information it has here, because it just goes outwards along the normal. And this is not going to be as sharp and nice as it would have been if I just started with something like this, and then I just extruded inward. And then I can always solve this intersection. So I'm going to undo this, and let's take a quick look at how we can block this into shapes already. So, because we've extended the door slightly downward, I'm going to have some trouble matching the reference, but I could always make this section symmetrical vertically, and there is other solutions on how to make it more visually pleasing. So let's see, this section we can always just start and cut it out something like this. We can even further, we can split it into section number 1, and then we can start working on the rest of the door. Now, because it doesn't quite match the reference, but simply because the reference doesn't sit well, I'll do the same thing I was doing before. I'll just duplicate it, offset it, duplicate the door, offset it as well, and then scale down the reference to match this part of the model, just so I don't need to adjust it too much. So I will do something like this. And now at least horizontally it does match. Now, how could we split it into two parts equally, three parts, apologies? I will just create a couple of edge loops. And again, like, this is not something that we need to ever concern ourselves with, like calculating the actual distance. All we have to do is just this, and this has split the model into equal distances. And let's see what else do we need to do. So I'll just add an edge loop here. And as you can see, like I mentioned before, the lines here on the wood are diagonal. So you can see all of those things, they're kind of made from separate pieces. And unlike stonework, which would go, the seams would go like this. And you can see all the diagonal lines. So now that we have this, we could start by trying to use some of the profiles we already have for those frames. So I believe if we grab something from the windows, it's gonna match, although not necessarily well. So I'll just grab this one and let's see how it goes, because if we can reuse it, it's gonna save us a lot of time. So I'll delete those faces, delete this, and let's bring it all the way over here. And let's see if we could match this section. Now, normally if I was matching the same material like the stonework, I would say it's not a good idea to scale it down, because now the scale of the bevels and the way the edges behave, it's going to be very different from the rest of the stonework. But because this is actually made out of wood, and wood sometimes tends to be just more sharp in general because, well, stonework crumbles, and probably this building has stood for longer than the door itself, which could have been replaced a couple of times. So I don't see a problem in that, and it also kind of helps us differentiate between the different materials. So I'm gonna scale it down for the time being and see how it behaves. If it looks well, I might just leave it as is, and if I feel that it's a bit too sharp, I could always just do something like merging the vertices with really high tolerancy, something like 0.2, 0.5 maybe, 0.4. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to merge and see to that all the bevels disappear as they are just merged into one edge. So let's say 35. So this is a bit better, still not perfect here, so 0.3. And instead of just trying to manually delete the bevel, sometimes this is the way to go. It's not ideal, it's creating a lot of bad topology, but sometimes you can maybe duplicate the parts of the model and use different values, just, you know, merge specific vertices into different stuff. Or, best case scenario, you can always go to an older version of my file and remember all those parts of the model that we're duplicating around. I can check which one of them doesn't have bevels yet, like this one for instance. And maybe it's even a better idea to just start fresh and go back a bit and duplicate it right over here. I'll offset this guy over here, and just like so, we have something that now we don't need to worry about the scale of the bevels, because we're just gonna add new ones, and here we go. Now, those parts are a bit more symmetrical, so probably it's a better idea anyway to start with something without bevels. I'll assign to it the same material, and I will call it wood door. And now all I have to do is just delete this, take it a couple of steps back, and start using the bend modifier to give it a nicer curvature. So I'm gonna try and strip down this part to the bare minimum, just so we don't have anything that interferes with our work. And from there we're gonna proceed and do the same work as we've done on everything else essentially, but still trying to make it somewhat more different to show that it's a different material that it's made of. So now that we have this rounded profile frame going around this entire piece of wood, I'm happy with that. And now we're gonna just grab this internal profile sorter, and I'm gonna use that in order to achieve this internal shape. So I'm gonna put it over here. And again, if I want to be accurate, which is probably a good idea, I'll just make sure it's symmetrical. And let's see if we actually need it to be, yeah, this is perfect. So sometimes, depending on your reference, you might need to make sure that actually this thickness is not double this thickness, but rather equal to it. But I think this time we can get away with it being double, but let's see. So in order to make sure that it's indeed in the center, we are going to grab the entire door, and we're going to start snapping things to other points just to make sure that we are achieving an accurate result. So this should be the center of this. So I'm gonna add an edge loop in the center at pivot, and snap it onto here. Merge those guys together, and then I'll just highlight those edges using a crease, just so I can see them better on the model. And I'm gonna add divisions. Not because we need divisions, but because I want to create those nice central edges onto which I can snap things. And you can see the moment it's a bit off, so I'm gonna snap it over here. And this is probably when I should scale it a bit. And again, we might need to make sure that we are calculating those things from this point and not this point, because it's a bit further apart. And when you have a small reference, it's a bit tricky sometimes to understand how it looks like. So I'm gonna improvise here a bit. So something like, let's just duplicate it and see how it looks. So potentially we might want to bring those a bit closer together, just so we have a slightly bigger border of the door. And besides, usually those doors, they would go inside some sort of a niche behind this stonework. So this entire door would probably be a couple of inches or a few centimeters wider than this stone frame. So let's say we have something like this. All we have to do then is just to grab those edges, give them a nice extrusion. Doesn't have to end here. I'd rather have it a bit longer and then cut it then where I need it. Give it a few nice subdivisions. And we could bend it into place. Or, alternatively, what we could do because we know exactly what is the center of this mesh, and we want to start it to bend from here. So I'll just move this guy a bit more to match the reference, and then I'll figure out how to blend them together better later. So what I could do, I could just create an edge here. So I'll just extrude those faces first. Doesn't have to be good or anything, doesn't have to merge with this, and then I'll create this non-manifold geometry, which is a big no-no, but we're gonna get rid of it later, and then I'm gonna select those faces and go to multi-selection mode, select this edge as well, which proves to be difficult because it's not a single edge, so I'm just gonna create it, merge it to be a single edge. So go to multi-selection again, select this edge, and go to our familiar wedge face, and wait 180 degrees and as many subdivisions as we need, maybe a bit fewer. We are now achieving a nice shape that is perfectly merging with where we need it to be, and is gonna help us on those rounded shapes. Not gonna help us as much on those S curves, but it's definitely gonna help us a lot. And one thing that I can already foresee is that we also need to have this profile on this side of the model as well. So instead of just using those faces, I will duplicate the model, I will delete the rest, I will scale those faces on a negative axis. I'll face transformations first, scale to negative axis, invert, merge, and bear in mind, whenever you accidentally merge faces with objects or something weird, you might corrupt your Maya file. So whenever you merge, check that you don't have a colon in front of the name of the mesh, because that usually means that it's something Maya doesn't recognize, and it's potentially gonna break your file. So here we go, and then multi, and then wedge face, and then 180, 24, maybe even 20 subdivisions. We don't need as many because it's rather a small object. When you look at it like this, it's fine. And besides, when you think of it, when you're making something out of wood, it's probably not gonna be as smooth anyway, or stone, because you would probably just do it with like small scoops as opposed to having a machine that just drills into it, unless of course it's modern times we're talking about. So we have this, we need to just remember to get rid of the internal faces which we have created, so those are here. And those are gonna be taken care of later, so I'm gonna select this section of the model. I'll just merge vertices and then get rid of the stuff that I don't need and separate it into a different model for the time being. And we also want this profile to be here, and the same thing, I will just duplicate this guy and rotate it. Bring it into here, and after some cleanup here, we can you can see what I'm trying to do here. This shape needs to be here. you can see how those shapes are starting to come together. And one last thing is that we need to make sure the intersection is correct. So we can see that here those edges are ending all together. So I'm just gonna take this shape, snap the pivot here onto the center edge, and make sure that it ends where it should end, just so it will form a nice and satisfying shape. And all we have to do now is just clean up this model using booleans, using knife, using whatever is your favorite way to clean up this. I wouldn't leave those as floaters simply because it looks fine now, but like you can see if I had a texture on it or whatever, it would flicker whenever you have those faces overlapping on top of each other. So one way to clean it up would be just to make sure that those shapes are fully... Oh, we need to get rid of those edges as well. So we either need to make sure that those shapes are watertight and delete all the unnecessary polygons and make sure that they are manifold, and then boolean them and then clean up. Or we could just use, like I've shown you before, the knife tool and just try and find the intersections with some dirty boolean that we use only as a guide. As you can see here, I went forward and I cleaned up the shape. Also, I wasn't entirely happy with what I was seeing. So I dug in my reference folder and I managed to find the original image I used to create the concept art. And it's just a small reminder that if you have something like this, that it's a bit low resolution and you can't really make out the shapes that you are seeing, it's not a bad idea to take a couple of steps back and look for a reference and make sure that you have the correct stuff, or if you have your reference made by somebody else, just to ask them what was their source of inspiration and then use it for your own needs. So what you can see here, I brought the profile and everything else to be a bit closer to the shape that we are seeing in the reference. But it's still not quite what it needs to be. And I still have quite a few shapes to add. I will be adding all of those rounded shapes. I will not be adding those sculpted trees or crosses or whatever. So I'll just make sure that I have enough material to work with for the rest of the shapes as well. And we're gonna proceed with it by just trying to understand the reference a bit closer and a bit better. So we can see that this is basically protruding out. Then we have about the same thickness that is rounded on both sides, and then it's straight and perpendicular to the camera again. And this same width that is here is also the same width you can see on those secondary shapes. So what I have done is looking here, and by the way, I did end up making this just as wide as this section instead of twice the width, because this was this is how it was looking in the reference. So what I did, I've extracted the faces from the center, and I duplicated them twice, just so we can see that we have 1/3, 2/3, and 3/3. And this is actually ended up being the width of the entire thing, which is good. So now we just need to find an edge that is corresponding to this one. And we don't quite have anything up close, so I'm gonna try and use a knife tool. And with snapping, holding Control and Shift, you can just snap it to half or 10% or 20% of whatever you want. So I'll just snap it to whatever is closest to this and whatever is closest to that. And now, because I do not need the second half, I will just delete it for the time being. Here we go. And again, this would have been a bit better if I did think ahead and I've modeled the profile before duplicating it around, but again, it's not a big deal. We can always work with it, and sometimes this is going to happen. So I will just delete the edges that I'm not using. So this is 1/3. So we can just get rid of all of this edge loop. And again, we need to make sure that we also have it on the other side as well. And to make sure of that, I will just duplicate this guy right over here. And I will try to sort of match this angle just so we know where 1/3 is. So it's about here. So what I will do, I will just take this edge and I will bevel it, which resulted in nothing, which means that I have some bad topology here. And you can see those edges, they should be okay. We can see there's some problematic stuff in here. So what I will do, I will just delete this whole section. And this one as well. Sometimes it's worth to just take it back a bit and then I'm back after I have cleaned it up because this was crashing my Maya and there was some weird stuff happening. So I will bevel it like so, and then I can get rid of this edge, and I could scale this down, and I could scale this one down as well. And now, just to make sure that we have the correct edges selected, I will give them a nice little crease, so they just look a bit thicker in the viewport. And again, I'll offset those a bit out of the way. And now we need to do the same thing on the other side as well, so I'll face transformations and I'll duplicate this guy. Same issue, so whenever we do this we can see that something is happening here probably, and yeah, that's the spot. So I'll just try and delete those faces and then bridge this. This is now fine, and then use append to polygon on this one. And now if we're gonna bevel this edge, it should be fine. Yes, it is. Something like this, and yeah, this is not ideal because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 polygons, and we don't want more than 5 merging into one point, unless it's a cup of a cylinder. But in this case, for the time being, I'm gonna leave it as is because a lot of this stuff is gonna be cleaned up once we have a bevel. So now what we need to make sure of is we need to have this sort of slightly rounded shape, which then becomes flat again. So to make this a bit rounded, I'll just first want to make sure that this is indeed 1/3 of the thickness, which is perfect. We can get rid of this edge because we no longer need it. And we can also get rid of, I'll leave this one be because it holds some edges in place for the time being. So I will grab this. And this one as well. And the thing is now, because we have it locked on a couple of axes and there is this line here which I don't want to ruin, what I will do, I will just extrude it and I will try to offset and move it only on certain axes. So you can see it will create those weird edges here, but looking from the front, it's still clean. So all I have to do is just to clean up those unnecessary polygons and edges. Just gonna merge this into one point, and here we go. We also need to get rid of this, which was created by the extrusion on the edge, and this is now looking okay. And this, if you remember, we need to make it flat, so I will just grab all of those faces that need to be flat, and I will scale them down to the edge that they should be flat. Okay, this is perfect. Now we can slightly cheat using those edges. What we can do is we could just select those because they're about 1/3. What we could do, we could just add 2 edge loops on the rest. And again, because this is quite a small part of the model, we can have a bit more freedom here. So I'm gonna delete this one. I'm gonna take the one that is closer to the flat edge, and again this is half, so split it into 2. So 1 to 3. Maybe scale it a bit down so it's a bit more close to being actually a third. This one is already at a third, so all we have to do is just do something like this, and then just make sure that it's more or less parallel. And we could fake it a bit, something like that. And again, this is not ideal solution, but it is still a solution, and I will just do something like this here. And again, because it's a carving of a wood and you're going here against fibers, in real life it wouldn't be very accurate anyway. There are more accurate ways to model it, but I think for what we are doing here, it's gonna do its job. So I'm gonna delete this edge, and I'm gonna take all the ones that should be on the outer part. I will make sure that they are on the same level, and I'm gonna push them in a bit. I'm gonna take the other one, and I'm gonna push that in as well. And this is gonna give us a bit more of a rounded profile. And because those inset faces, which we inset before, sticking in a bit too much, I'm gonna bring them out a bit. And potentially, now that I'm looking at it, I'll probably need to offset this edge a bit out as well. Okay, and then we don't need this. And then this can be snapped here. And now we have it. Now the profile is a bit more accurate and it looks closer to the reference. We no longer need those, and what we can do now is we can start looking at those shapes, the secondary shapes, and the way they are done is, if we look at the reference, basically they start from this flat edge, and they also have this sort of feathering rounded shape to it, which we also will need to add to the internal one as well. So we'll start by doing this, and given that those are already snapped to the center, all I have to do is just create a knife tool and then get rid of one of those, get rid of the second one, snap it over here, and this is now looking perfect. So all we have to do is to make sure that on the inside it still has the same sort of shape. Another thing that we need to pay attention to is that it's way thinner compared to the original shape I was using, so we don't need a lot of those edges. So we maybe need only this many. So this can go, this can go. And whilst this process is a bit tedious and time consuming, I feel that when done right, it's gonna help us achieve very beautiful results. And to me, it's one of those times when I can actually relax and focus on my music in my headphones and just model away instead of trying to think of different things. Now, we need to mimic this shape in here as well. So the way I will do it, I will just eyeball it. I will grab this guy from over here. I will extrude it just so we have something that is straight. And again, I wouldn't extrude it from the edge. It goes a bit at an angle because it will give me inconsistent width, but this one is perfectly straight, so we're just gonna do this, and then we're gonna snap it to any of the points here per se, actually even better at the bottom, and we will rotate it. And now all we have to do is we need to extrude it, and we're gonna give it the same thickness as much as we can. Seemingly it's nearly perfect, so maybe for 1, or maybe I'll just go all the way and then 8.9, 8.8 perhaps, 8.85. And if you need to be a bit more accurate, you can always increase the decimal points and have 4 decimal points instead of just 3 in Maya. or you can just type in 65, 67. It wouldn't work if you don't have it, but if you go to settings, you can adjust it here. But I think I will just go with 87, even though it's not perfectly accurate, and I'm gonna leave it as is. So now I'm just gonna bring those edges to where they should be. And here we go. Now, in the end, I will be beveling everything like on the rest of the model, but just so I can see visually what I'm doing, I'm adding soft edges and hard edges where I need to for the time being. So this is starting to look good, and it's starting to match the reference. Now we just need to make sure we have all the shapes here and those spikes. And one thing I would recommend is before you go ahead and you merge and clean up those shapes, duplicate them to the side, because we're gonna have to reuse the same shapes probably here and in other parts of the model as well, and definitely here. So make sure you have some sort of kit brush set that you can use from those parts, such as the parts I duplicated here, which I should reduplicate again as they are no longer relevant. And just save those for later because you're gonna need them. And now all you have to do is just to make sure that you are duplicating the secondary shapes and you're adding more detail where it needs to be. And once it's all done, just, you know, boolean everything like this, and, you know, just switch between different blending modes. And even if it doesn't give you a pretty result such as this, because you can see there's like some cleanup that needs to be done here, and it reversed the normals on this part of the model, but on this one it didn't. This is something, for example, that is workable. All you have to do is just to make sure that you delete edges that aren't supposed to be there, and you're good to go.